Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is a discussion of the Hacker Literacies chapter in the CDL book by Rafi Santo. Let's get the full title here. Hacker Literacies, User-Generated Resistance and Reconfiguration of Network Publics. Now, I thought this was a really great chapter. I got a lot out of this, and I hope you will too, as we dive a little deeper in and see if we can pick at some of the issues that Rafi raises here. So this is big contention here. There's a lot of work being done in critical digital literacies. There's a whole book about it that we're reading this semester. But Santos sees something missing in this, right? And he says it here. The current conversation happening around participatory media literacies. And just to pause there for a second, participatory media, this is a term that comes to us from Henry Jenkins. He's got a couple of books now. He's got one called Convergence Culture and another one called Spreadable Media. And also, I think to some extent, Larry or Lawrence Lessig has some books on this. Remix culture or free culture being one of these. But anyway, the idea behind that, as you probably inferred from the chapter, is that instead of a producer just putting the content out there and people passively receiving it, watching a movie, reading a blog post, for example, they're actually called upon to participate in some way. It could be by commenting on that blog, or maybe remixing the movie, or you think about an online game, you're participating in that in various ways. All right, so anyway, the conversations about all that concerning empowerment through new media. So in other words, we've been talking a lot about how the option to leave a comment on a let's say St. Cloud Times article that you read on their news website. It's sort of empowering, right? That you can leave a comment there and debate some point that's been raised and have a discussion around that. So that's empowering. But this author wants to take it a step further and say what we really need to be talking about is empowerment in relation to new media. So this is a very interesting argument that he's making here. And I'll see if I can clarify this a bit in case you might be confused exactly as to what he's arguing. It comes back to this point here. His definition of hacker literacies, and of course he makes it clear that by hacker he's not talking about some kind of criminal behavior, identity theft, or anything like that. Rather, he's going back to that definition of hacker that you might see in a book like Hackers, Heroes of the Computer Revolution by Stephen Levy, or maybe Richard Stallman stuff. Looked at his GNU manifesto, all this kind of stuff. So basically, the idea is it's you should be allowed to change up a piece of software however you see fit. It's kind of the free software, the GNU model, right? So if you're using a product like Microsoft Word and you don't like some part of that software, it doesn't work the way you think it should, or maybe you just don't think it works the way it should for you, according to this hacker movement, you should be allowed to go in there, change up that code. Now, whether you have the skills or not, that's a different issue, right? But you should have the right to change it however you see fit, and that means having access to the source code to be able to do all that. So anyway, this author wants to expand that definition, I think, a little bit, but it's basically the same thing. So hacker literacies is empowered participatory practices grounded in critical mindsets that aim to resist, reconfigure, and or reformulate the socio-technical digital spaces and tools that mediate social, cultural, and political participation. So the example that comes up all the time in Stallman's work with Free Software Foundation, I used to drink their Kool-Aid, all the time. I was really into this free software movement. I've sort of tweaked my views on it a little bit, but some of it I definitely agree with. So anyway, the example that Stallman always gives of the problem here is, I think he was at MIT's Artificial Intelligence Lab or some place like that, and they got a printer in the lab one day, and this is back, I guess, in the 70s or so, and it still happens today. The printer drivers weren't compatible with the computers that they had, and normally, since he knew all this programming stuff, he would have just written his own drivers, right? Got in there, got to the code, and made his own driver. sort of like you might see in the Linux community today. But the problem was the printer manufacturer had actually made that private, so he couldn't get to that code. Um, it was proprietary software. He didn't have access to the human readable code part of it. So basically, he wasn't allowed to change that code to make the driver work. So that really angered Stallman and kind of launched that little incident basically launched this whole free software movement. And I think that Santo is kind of getting at this too. We sort of have gotten away from this hacker mentality. People that use software nowadays don't think so much about it's a piece of software. You could change it if you had access to the code and use some programming, right? We just kind of accept it. It is what it is. It's kind of how we look at software. And Santo, I think, wants us to get us back into that mentality. So anyway, I'll just stop right here. What do you think about this argument so far? Does hacker literacy sound like something valuable to you and to your students? So moving a little further along, this is another piece of the argument, and I've been talking about in the instructions for the proposals about the theoretical framework. So I just thought I would draw your attention to this passage, because this is where the author of this article is pointing at some of the scholarship, some of his basically looking at some of his theoretical framework piece of it here. A definition of literacy by Langsher, and I believe that's Noble. I could be wrong. But anyway, they have a definition of literacy that he wants to use as part of his theoretical framework. And it goes like this. Socially recognized, so literacy is socially recognized ways of generating, communicating, and negotiating meaningful content through the medium of encoded texts within contexts of participation in discourses or as members of discourses. To be honest with you, if this was in a thesis or even an essay that the student presented to me, I'd probably say I wanted them to unpack this a little bit more. It seems like he's kind of assuming we're more familiar with this Langsher Noble argument than we are. But nevertheless, it's sort of a nod towards, look, here's where I'm coming from theoretically. And you could really I don't really want to get into this quotation that deeply here at the moment, but you can see there's quite a bit of depth here to this definition of literacy, just thinking about even like socially recognized ways. So in other words, it's kind of a matter of social convention rather than, I guess, instinct or something beyond human powers. The word negotiating there is interesting. So you negotiate meaning. That's kind of an interesting way to think about meaning. A lot of us think of, well, it means what it means in the dictionary, right? And you look it up in the dictionary, and that's what it means. Of course, there's been a lot of criticism of that idea. We see it here. Meaningful content. There's a whole bunch we could do with that term, meaningful. What does it mean for something to mean something? How is that different than intending or intention? The word content, even like the idea of encoded texts. What does it mean, encoded? Context of participation in discourses. And when you finally get to that part about discourses, I assume that's a reference back to Stanley Fish and his whole idea of interpretive communities, or maybe the discourse community idea. That the part of that idea is that we don't just come to a text with a blank slate. That basically, before you even get to that text, before you even think about interpreting a text, you have been a member of an interpretive community that's basically established some parameters for you that's going to some extent, determine how you interpret a text. So it's not just a matter of individual interpretation. There's always sort of some baggage you bring to it through these communities of interpretation. So anyway, you can see just from this one quotation, all those different theories, Stanley Fish, maybe even the sophistic views of somebody like Gorgias or Protagoras, thinking about negotiating meaning. I bet you that if you read the Langsher Noble, you might come across maybe even some Foucault, but maybe Derrida seems to be back there somewhere, maybe Norman Fairclough. So anyway, just pointing this out as an example of somebody pointing at a piece of a theoretical framework. All right, moving then forward into some further into this article, he talks about the technical versus the social features, and he mentions at times how we think about a hacker, computer, maybe just computer programmer, computer wizards, whatever, as being these sort of nerdy people that don't have any friends and they live in the basement, right? Or maybe they're very technically gifted, but they have no social skills. That seems to be the stereotype. So at first he says that's not really true. Forget about that stereotype. But he's getting at a more important point here. So he's talking about how the technical features, I'll just read the quotation. So technical features afford and constrain certain social behaviors, and at the same time are always themselves shaped by social actors, whether they are users, designers, or other stakeholders. And then later he comes back to this. He calls it a dialectic relationship, which, talking about theoretical framework, that word seems to come from either Marxism or maybe he's going all the way back to Hegel, the philosopher Hegel, with that idea. But anyway, the dialectic relationship is kind of a back and forth sort of an argument. Of course, is what makes these spaces malleable, and so is foundational to their reformulation and reconfiguration through various practices. Okay, so what are we talking about here? I think of the example that I think it's Cindy Self gives. She's got a wonderful essay called the politics. I think it's called something like the politics of the interface, and something like that for the title. And she talks about things like Microsoft Word and Microsoft Windows, and how there's a lot of sort of rhetorical stuff going on. It's not just it has to be that way from a technological point of view, but sort of like this metaphor of the file folders, for example, like everything's a file, everything's a folder. As he says, that's sort of something from the business world, right? The office world. And it could have been a different type of metaphor. It could have been, oh, here's a kitchen, right? And you put things into cabinets, or you put things into cupboards, right? So I mean, she uses that as an example of saying, look, it could have been all these other things, right? It didn't have to be these file folders and little paper clips and things. That's actually shows you how the social behaviors, or social world of the Microsoft team, they probably did. I'm sure they were surrounded by file cabinets and things. And so that actually kind of bled over into the technical design of the software. But the point is, it didn't have to be that way, and it could change. Right? There's no reason it has to be that way, I think is what we're getting at here. And this idea of a dialectic relationship, so that would be, you don't want to think of it as just, hey, we don't have any say over this. Microsoft makes a product. Our only choice is whether we buy the product or not. Santo wants to say, we should kind of reject that attitude. And, if we can't reformulate the software, if we can't reconfigure it somehow, we should engage in one of these activities, one of these sort of responses that he gives. I'll get back to that in a minute, though. Okay, so what are some risks involved if we don't teach hacker literacies? He gives some examples of these. Filter bubbles, which is a concept a lot of my students have found useful when they talk about the rhetoric of all this stuff. So you might have heard this term before, a filter bubble. But basically, Google or Amazon or whatever, they give you different kinds of results when you search depending on your behaviors, right? So it's basically tracking your behavior. I think too about Facebook sometimes, and how you can say, there's an option now where if you don't like something that you see on your wall, you can say, don't show me stuff like this, or hide stuff from this friend, right? So basically what it creates is kind of a filter bubble, so that if you and your friend search for the same term, let's say you both search for Bernie Sanders or something like that, right? Depending on your sort of behaviors on all these whatever kind of data this software is collected about you, it will give you a different set of results than your friend. So the danger is with that, you could be getting a very limited view of what's out there. I've also heard this described as an echo chamber, right? It's just, you're seeing all the stuff that agrees with your point of view because you would reject anything else. So it's kind of a danger there. And something a hacker literacies could say or could do for you is to show you how to escape that filter bubble, right? So what are some ways you can force Google to show you those results that sort of unfiltered results? Maybe there's some other search engines you could use instead. So that would be an example of that. Architecture of exploitation. I think a lot of us have thought about this with Facebook, for example, or YouTube, or Amazon even. All of these sites and how they're basically collecting data. You're providing value to them when you post reviews or you buy products, rate things, and in some ways you're being exploited, right? You're helping them to build up these databases. Now, a really good example of this was Turnitin.com. This was an anti-plagiarism detection service, and there was some problems. A lot of computers and writing people were upset about this tool because although it was useful for detecting plagiarism, I mean, there's no question about that. The problem was to detect the plagiarism, it collected all these student essays. Every time a student submitted an essay to this, it would basically take their name off, supposedly encrypt it somehow, but it basically became a part of the Turnitin.com database. So the students didn't have any say in this. They were forced to accept this Turnitin.com system, or they wouldn't get a grade. They could just get enough on the paper, I guess, if they didn't submit it. So they were saying that it's kind of exploitative, right? So it's taking their essays for use by this for-profit company against them, right? So that was a problem. So a good hacker, I guess, could find all kinds of ways to exploit Turnitin.com, and sure enough, they found ways to do this. And then finally, the privacy debacle. And they talked about Facebook. I was thinking more recent news. You probably heard about this terrorism case. I don't know if it's the CIA or the FBI or somebody's trying to get Apple to create a backdoor. The article actually uses the term, which I thought was very prescient. But basically, Apple should have to put this backdoor system into an iPhone, into all the not just the iPhone, I guess, but any kind of Apple device, so that when there's some kind of a threat of terrorism, or they need to collect evidence, the FBI could go in there through this back door and see all your stuff, right? So Apple's apparently fighting back. They don't want to hand this data over. So that is something to think about. Encryption, of course, being a very important part on all sides of hacking. Something else I wanted to say about this, though. The author talks a little bit about. It seems like he's suggesting. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it sounded almost to me like he was saying maybe we're blowing this privacy fear stuff out of proportion a little bit. You probably do know people that are afraid to do anything online. I mean, there's still people that won't buy anything online. I've worked with students before that refused to log into anything. They wouldn't use any of the software that if they had to log in first, create an account, anything like that. They didn't want their pictures on the internet anywhere. And they did get to the point where it was very difficult for them to progress in the class because especially in like a soft class where you're trying to learn software, it's very difficult if you're unwilling or no matter how good a reason is, you can't really use a piece of software sometimes if you can't register on that. So I was thinking about that, and I had a lot of trouble at the time thinking about this. I didn't know how I really felt about it. People have very legitimate reasons to be wary, right? And not want to just post personal stuff online. I totally get that. On the other hand, is it maybe it is, somebody's that sort of I don't want to make them sound bad, like cowardly or anything, but I mean, if somebody's really that reticent to participate online for whatever reason, maybe that's kind of damaging to them. So I really don't know what to make of this last point. Nobody's ever really given me a really good answer, where you kind of draw the line with that kind of stuff. If you wanted to use D2L, for example, and you had students that I'm not going to use D2L because I have privacy concerns, well, what do you do, right? I don't know. Maybe I'll just let you answer the question. What do you do? Okay, so then to wrap this up, He talks a little bit about what are some examples of empowered participatory practices. And he talks about these individual actions, things that the individual can do or not do. He might just say, well, if Apple gives in and creates this backdoor, then by golly, I'm going to go with Android instead. So you could do that sort of thing, or you could just not put anything private into your phone. That'd be pretty difficult, I think. Voicing alternative designs. This is something I found very useful. A lot of these tools that we use, like Edpuzzle, for example, the Canvas, another example. A lot of times I've used the product for a while, found some issues that I have with it, maybe just had some ideas, proposed those ideas to the companies and actually had them implement those ideas, or at least tell me that they're thinking about it. So anyway, that's just something you can do, always do. I think it's useful. I mean, these companies want to succeed, right? And so I think that's not something you should just dismiss. And then finally, advocating collective actions, which you could boycott the site. But you get some other examples. Now, this was the best part of the article, I thought, was when he talked about the history of the hashtag. Now, I really didn't know about this. I kind of assumed Twitter had come up with hashtags. But really, it was kind of this hacker guy, right? He figured out a way that they could create these sort of issues or topics on Twitter just by putting that pound sign in front of a term. And this, of course, really caught on, and of course, it got appropriated by Twitter and by everybody else. So that was some really clever stuff. Of course, that wouldn't have happened without that social behavior, right? So you had the technical affordance, which this idea of affordance and constraint, I believe he's getting that from Donald Norman's book, the Design of Everyday Things, which is another good book you can read for part of a theoretical framework. But anyway, people had to use the hashtag, right? It wouldn't have gone anywhere if you'd said, look, I got this great idea. Let's put this pound sign in front of a topic, a buzzword or whatever. And this will, if nobody had done it, it wouldn't have gone anywhere. So it was something that was there to be used, but it depended on the other Twitter users to pick it up and run with it, right? And then he talks about this kid that was on Second Life, sort of in this ghetto for kids, a sort of kid zone, I guess. And he basically launched, kind of got almost, I guess you'd say political with it, right? And sort of organized a movement to do something about this ghettoization, I guess you could. That sounds a little grandiose a term for this, but anyway, that was collective action. All right, so here's the takeaway point from this, I think. Before I get to that, though, I wanted to come back to this idea of empowered participatory practices. I wanted to ask if you know of other examples of any one of these three that you would like to share. I think it'd be fun to collect some of these ideas and talk about them further in the nugget. Okay, so anyway, back to this takeaway point. So without incorporating critical practices into participatory ones, without the development of hacker literacies, people may find themselves living in a digitally mediated culture dictated by interests other than their own. I think this is something I've seen. I've been very critical of this idea at the university level of using D2L. Not that I have anything against D2L. I'm sure it's a fine program, and I've used it before, but I don't like the idea of that being imposed on me and anybody being forced to use it, especially since there's all these alternatives out there, and what if a D2L doesn't do what it is I need to do? I don't want that. I don't want somebody else deciding what software I want to use in my class, that I'm teaching. I think for me, it's kind of an academic freedom issue, really. Yeah, I would be just as offended if somebody came into a class and said, look, here's the book you're going to use. If I'm a TA, that's one thing, right? But a professor, you're supposed to have a say over that kind of thing, right? At least I think you should. I think TA should, for that matter. But anyway, so this, you can think about this at a larger scale as well. What if they have to create this back door? If Apple's sort of forced into this, that's a decision that's being made for us. It's probably not maybe we think it might be, we could argue this point, right? Some people might think it's in our best interest to have a backdoor in your phone. Other people say, no, I don't want that. But the point, I guess, that we want to get to here is what could you do about it if you didn't know anything about coding, if you didn't know anything about the technology, and you just assumed you were powerless? Well, if Apple puts in that back door, then I've got no choice but, to run this risk. So I think that's what that sort of attitude is what this whole article is trying to challenge, right? And to make you or to help you to see that this is something you could have some power over. I guess, if you want to run with this hacker literacies thing all the way, I would say, well, if they do that, you could jailbreak your phone. By jailbreak, you could, hack the software that's on there and put some other software on there that would possibly have better privacy controls, that sort of thing. So anyway, a lot of thought here. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, so this is probably why has run on a little longer than the other ones. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts about all this. If there's anything else you want to talk about that we didn't raise here, just let me know. But anyway, that's enough for now. Hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time.